The fauna of the first period of the Mesozoic era, the Triassic, was much more varied than the dinosaur-dominated faunas of the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. Besides the early dinosaurs, it also included a number of other large reptiles, including the terrestrial relatives of crocodilians, as well as proto-mammalian holdovers from the Permian period. One of the most enigmatic Triassic creatures is Doswelliidae. This heavily armored, 2-meter-long reptile had a flat skull, elongated snout, long neck, and short limbs. Predominantly thought to have been a semi-aquatic animal which inhabited freshwater environments, further details of Doswellia's ecology remain understudied, in spite of its numerous oddities. It was first identified from a skeleton found in 1974 by Dr. Nicholas Houghton III, Robert Weems, and its partial namesake, James Kaltenbach, and its other namesake, the Virginian community of Doswell. The skeleton is semi-articulated and nearly complete, but lacks the upper jaw, most of the limbs, and much of the tail. Still, this specimen is exceptional, as the assemblage it was found in, the Newark supergroup, contains few other well-preserved body fossils. Doswellia was given an official description in 1980 by the now Dr. Robert Weems. Other, less complete fossils collected decades earlier from the region were recognized as belonging to Doswellia, and additional Doswellia fossils were found later in Texas and Arizona, although the Doswell skeleton still remains the most complete specimen belonging to this prehistoric reptile. The age of these fossils spans a substantial length of time. The oldest Doswellia fossils are 228 million years old, dating to the late Carnian age of the late Triassic, predating the arrival of dinosaurs to North America. The youngest are 220 million years old, dating to the Nourian age. This makes Doswellia a contemporary of some of the most iconic Triassic animals, such as Postosuchus, the tusked stem mammal Plycarius, and the early theropod dinosaur Coelophysis. Although the specifics of its relationships were unclear when it was first found, it was apparent that Doswellia was a relative of the archosaurs, the ruling reptiles. Archosauria is a clade formed by dinosaurs and crocodilians, and is the crown group of the much more inclusive clade archosauromoprh, which consists of all reptiles more closely related to the archosaurs than to any other living species, with the possible exception of turtles. Archosauromoprh was highly successful during the Triassic period, but the more basal branches were largely supplanted by the more derived archosaurs during the late Triassic. As for where Doswellia Kaltenbach fits in, it was a member of Archosauriformes, the clade consisting of Archosauria and closely related archosauromorphs which already possessed most of the traits that made the archosaurs so successful compared to other reptiles. Early archosauriforms had an intermediate metabolism, which was further developed into a true endothermic, or warm-blooded, metabolism in some archosaurs like the dinosaurs. To summarize, Archosauromorpha, Archosauriformes, and Archosauria are increasingly exclusive subgroups of each other, and Doswellia is a member of the former two clades, but does not belong to Archosauria. Dr. Robert Weems, the paleontologist who had originally described Doswellia, considered it to be a basal but specialized survivor of the Proterochampsids, who were otherwise unknown from the late Triassic. He was technically right, because these reptiles are now known to have actually been ancestral to the rest of Archosauriformes, including the archosaurs. After its initial description, but before science had a good understanding of archosauriform interrelationships, Doswellia was often classified as a member of Pseudosuchia, the branch of Archosauria more closely related to crocodilians than to dinosaurs. Modern studies of archosauriform evolution have found that Doswellia wasn't an archosaur, but the distance between it and primitive archosauriforms like the Proterochampsids was much greater than Dr. Weems initially thought. They have consistently placed it much closer to the true archosaurs, potentially even more so than Euparkeria, the reptile often considered to be the closest approximation of what the first archosaurs looked like. Unlike Euparkeria, it is clear that Doswellia diverged significantly from its last common ancestor with the ruling reptiles. When Doswellia was first found, it was sufficiently different from anything else that it was assigned its own clade, Doswelliidae, but other Doswellids have been found over the years. The oldest is Jaxtosuchus. It lived in what is now Germany during the Middle Triassic. While obscure, it is known from fairly complete remains, missing only the neck, most of the skull, and parts of the tail, filling some of the holes in Doswellia's anatomy. Like Doswellia, the rest of the Doswellids are from North America. The closest relative of Doswellia is the 3-meter-long Rugarynchos sixmilenus, which is found in the southwestern Chinle Formation. When it was first found, Rugarynchos was actually thought to be a second species of Doswellia, Doswellia sixmilenus. This was the first official report of Doswellia in the Chinle Formation, and while it is now known to have been erroneous, Doswellia Kaltenbachii fossils have been found there since then. The other definitive Doswellids are Ankylosuchus and Sphodrosaurus, the latter of which is notable for its proportionately large skull. The number of archosauroforms which have been mistakenly assigned to Doswelliidae over the years almost outnumber its genuine members. Perhaps the strangest was Scaleromoculus, a tiny reptile known from complete but poorly preserved skeletons. While it has generally been considered an early relative of dinosaurs and pterosaurs, in 2020, paleontologist Dr. Christopher Bennett proposed that it was instead a Doswellid, albeit one specialized for hopping rather than swimming. However, following a more accurate reconstruction of the skeletons, which was made possible through the application of X-ray microtomography, it was determined that Scaleromoculus was an early relative of pterosaurs after all. The fragmentary taxa, Archaeopelta and Tardigrades, were also formally assigned to Doswelliidae. However, following the discovery of more complete remains of Tardigrades, it became apparent that they belonged to Herpetosuchidae, a small branch of Pseudosuchia. Finally, there is the short-snouted Vanclevia. It was a contemporary of Doswellia, and is thought to have been an even more specialized aquatic predator than the true Doswellids were. Following the discovery of Vanclevia's closest relative, Literosuchus, it is no longer considered to be a member of Doswelliidae. However, it and Literosuchus are thought to have belonged to Proterochampsia, the same subclade of Archosauriformes as the Doswellids. The Proterochampsians are often considered to be the closest relatives of the Archosaurs. The only reptiles which might be closer are the Phytosaurs, who may instead belong to Archosauria itself. The other major branch of Proterochampsians are the Proterochampsids, although similarities between them and the basal Doswellid Sphodrosaurus have led to the proposal that they may instead be ancestral to the Doswellids. Proterochampsids were small predators which have been primarily found in South America. Like Doswellia, they had flat skulls and even longer snouts. While traditionally seen as crocodile analogues, recent years have seen a more terrestrial interpretation of some members of Proterochampsidae. On the other hand, Doswellia and the rest of Doswelliidae are still generally held to have been universally semi-aquatic. Unsurprisingly, Doswellia's closest modern analogues are Crocodilians. Like them, its eyes were at the top of its flat skull, which allowed it to search its surroundings while keeping most of its body submerged. Based on the fossils of other Doswellids, it is inferred that the same was true of its nostrils. The back of Doswellia's jaws were also deep to provide space for powerful jaw muscles, and reinforce it to withstand the impressive force they generated. As a result, its skull was largely akinetic, which differs from the more flexible skulls of the Proterochampsids. In a departure from Crocodilians, the muscles which opened Doswellia's jaws were also strong. Those of Crocodilians are so weak that a human can hold them shut, something regularly exploited by the late crocodile hunter Steve Irwin. In contrast, Doswellia's lower snout was thinner than those of most Crocodilians, suggesting that although a powerful bite was important for Doswellia, it hadn't evolved to regularly hunt large animals. In any event, it was clearly a carnivore. Its sharp teeth were conical, grooved, and slightly recurved, overall not differing too much from those of crocodilians, which are ideal for catching and holding onto slippery prey. However, Doswellia had smaller, rounder teeth on its petragoid, the bone that formed its palate. These blunt palantal teeth were instead best suited for crushing. While Doswellia's upper snout is unfortunately still missing, one has been found belonging to its relative Rugorhynchos. Most of the teeth filled 3 notches, which could have evolved to help it hold onto fish or other prey. The teeth surrounding the notches were longer, with those at the tip of the snout being the largest. The lower jaw lacked these notches, and with the exception of the teeth at the tip, its dentation was more uniform in size. One of the more unusual aspects of Doswellia's anatomy was its fenestrae, or openings in its skull. Reptiles typically have 2 fenestrae at the back of the skull, called temporal fenestrae. Doswellia lacked the lower temporal fenestra, which is called the euryapsid condition, and independently evolved in a number of other reptiles. Other euryapsids include many of the Mesozoic marine reptiles, such as the long-necked plesiosaurs, as well as a few fellow archosauromorphs like the long-snouted Pteranodon. However, the lower temporal fenestra was retained in the Doswellid Jaxtasuchus. Archosauriformes developed 2 more distinctive fenestrae, the antorbital fenestra in front of the orbits, and the mandibular fenestra in the lower jaw, the latter of which is absent in Doswellia. Both the mandibular and lower temporal fenestrae house important jaw muscles, and the back of Doswellia's jaws were probably so large to compensate for their absence. Due to its incomplete skull, it is currently impossible to determine whether or not Doswellia possessed an antorbital fenestra, although its presence has been confirmed in the closely related Rugorhynchos. A pair of bones at the top of Doswellia's skull, the squamosals, were unusual in that they extended backwards, creating horn-like projections. In life, they were likely covered up by its long neck. It was flexible for the most part, but its ability to flex upwards was hindered by its armor. Doswellia's torso was also very atypical, as the ribs were not curved. Instead, they extended out in a long, straight line before pointing straight down. The ribs near the forelimbs were deep, but they were shallow by the middle of the torso, with a wide gap between them and the gastralia, the belly ribs. In contrast, the horizontal portion only modestly decreased in length before reaching the hips, extending to the base of the tail as in crocodilians. While their bodies are streamlined to help them move through the water, Doswellia's skeleton had a more rectangular shape on account of its unusual ribs. However, soft tissue may have evened out the shape of the living animal. Jaxtasuchus had a similar torso to Doswellia, but the ribs of the basal Doswellid Sphodrosaurus were longer and gently curved. The vertebrae were concave on both ends, limiting their flexibility. The articular processes of the trunk vertebrae were also positioned at a low angle, further restricting their vertical flexation. The hips were also distinctive from other archosauromorphs, as the iliac blades at the top were long and flared outwards. At the bottom, both the pubis and ischium were short and curved downwards. The first 5 vertebrae of Doswellia's tail were built like those from its abdomen. What is thought to have been the 8th tail vertebrae was bent, so unlike most other archosauriforms, but like crocodilians, Doswellia may have been a tail dragger. Functionally, the similarities end there, as a crocodilian's tail is tall, flattened, and moves side to side to propel them through the water. While not reflected in this otherwise excellent illustration, Doswellia's tail was instead wide and had poor horizontal flexibility. Since their vertical flexibility was much better, Doswellia would have still been able to efficiently swim by moving its wide tail up and down, essentially using the inverse strategy of crocodilians for the same end. True archosaurs, including the ancestors of crocodilians, had an upright stance, while the limb posture of more basal archosauriforms, like the Proterochampsians, was intermediate between them and the sprawling stance of most other reptiles. Indeed, given how their limbs are shorter than those of most Proterochampsids, Doswellia and the other Doswelliids seem to have reverted to a more primitive stance as a consequence of their semi-aquatic lifestyles, much as crocodilians have returned to a semi-erect gait. The hind limbs of Jaxtasuchus were also longer than its forelimbs, which would have further hampered its running speed. Still, the legs of Doswelliids, including the limited limb material belonging to Doswellia, are strongly built, which is thought to have been an adaptation for digging. Supporting this, the claws of the Doswellid Sphodrosaurus were long and recurved, matching those of other modern diggers like armadillos. They could have helped them to scourge through the muddy substrate or to dig burrows. In the original description of Doswellia, Dr. Weem suggested that it used a similar defense mechanism as armadillos. The idea is that, when threatened by a larger carnivore, Doswellia would rapidly dig a small burrow, curl its tail up underneath its abdomen, and hunker down to protect its vulnerable underside. This was possible because its neck, back, and tail were protected by osteoderms, small bones which grew within its skin. Doswellia's osteoderms were rectangular in shape, possessed an elevated ridge, and were covered with small pits. They were arranged into neat rows, with the widest row consisting of 10 osteoderms. The osteoderms which covered Doswellia's elongated neck were fused together into an inflexible, rigid neutral plate. With the exception of the hips, the rest of the osteoderms were overlapping, with smooth sections to accommodate each other on the interior ends, those pointing towards the head. Heavily armored pseudosuchians called Dinosaurs also had smooth sections on the interior ends of their otherwise heavily ornamented osteoderms. In both cases, this helped to reduce the rigidity of these archosauriforms' armor. Growth rings have been found in the osteoderms of the Doswellia holotype. There are 13 rings in total, which suggests the individual was at least as many years old when it died, supporting the idea that the 2-meter-long individual was a fully grown adult. Internally, Doswellia's osteoderms consist of 3 layers, with a layer of dense bone on either end surrounding spongier, cancellous bone. This structure would have reduced their buoyancy, a clear advantage for an animal that spent significant amounts of time in the water. However, compact osteoderms have also been discovered in primarily terrestrial animals, such as the ankylosaurian dinosaurs. A study of the histology of Doswellia's osteoderms conducted in 2017 found that, contrary to the osteoderms found in most other animals, the ridges and pits were formed from growth rather than the reabsorption of the surrounding bone. Evidence for this same strategy has been found in some of the large, carnivorous loricatan pseudosuchians that were ancestral to today's crocodilians. However, it was not the case for all Doswellids, as the ornamentation of Jaxtasuchus's osteoderms was formed through the traditional method of reabsorption. The same study also found that Doswellia's osteoderms lack structural fibers. This implies they were formed through intramembraneous ossification, meaning they were formed directly from stem cells. Intramembraneous ossification is also thought to have been employed during osteoderm development by some extinct pseudosuchians, such as Reptile and Tardigrades, but the osteoderms of most extant animals, including crocodilians, are formed through metaplastic ossification, where they are converted from other, intermediate types of tissue. A common theme regarding Doswellia's osteoderms is similarities to those of pseudosuchians, which is why it was once misclassified as one, and why some herpetosuchids were more recently misclassified as Doswellids. Although a number of comparisons can be drawn between Doswellia's and pseudosuchian osteoderms, the relevant species all belong to different branches of Pseudosuchia, so the similarities are a clear case of convergent evolution. While Doswellia's armor consisted of numerous columns of similar bony plates, the armor of most Triassic pseudosuchians was instead centered around a pair of rows over the vertebrae called paramedian osteoderms. However, after hundreds of millions of years, the arrangement of the osteoderms on the backs of crocodilians has actually become closer to that of the Doswellids. The armor of many other crocodiline archosaurs also spread to other parts of their bodies, such as their belly and legs. While not as closely related to each other as once thought, The osteoderms found in Doswellia and Crocodilians are homologous, meaning they were inherited from a common ancestor. Osteoderms were also present in other early archosauriforms, and were ancestral to Archosauria. As a side note, osteoderms were quickly lost in the dinosaur line archosaurs, although they were present in the most basal member, Mambachaton. They were later reacquired by some dinosaurs, most notably in the heavily armored thyreophorans like the ankylosaurs. While generally regarded as a semi-aquatic carnivore, Doswellia's place in the ecosystems of late Triassic North America is otherwise a mystery. While there was a substantial degree of evolutionary convergence between it and Crocodilians, there are too many functional differences between them for it to have filled a similar niche. As mentioned earlier, although Doswellia had a powerful bite force, its snout was not sturdy enough to safely hold onto large animals. Thin snouts can be found in some specialized piscivorous, or fish-eating, crocodilians like the gharial. However, Doswellia's snout was also much shorter than the highly elongated snouts of these species, and even the snouts of some other Proterochampsians. A diet of fish also wouldn't explain the presence of its petrigoid teeth, which were suited for crushing, and would have been of little use for catching or dismembering such prey. Additionally, the Triassic rivers and wetlands had no shortage of crocodile analogues. The most prominent were the phytosaurs, who could easily be mistaken for actual crocodiles. A number of giant tesnospondyle amphibians also hunted in the Triassic waters. Doswellia would have needed to fill a very different niche from them to eke out a living in this environment, especially given the presence of other aquatic Proterochampsians, such as Vanclevia. Unfortunately, most scientific papers about Doswellids have put little thought towards their ecology beyond concluding that they were semi-aquatic, the only major exception being the original description of Doswellia by Dr. Robert Weems, who suggested several potential prey items. The first of these, insects, were notably envisioned as being pursued within a terrestrial setting. While its conical teeth closely resemble those of crocodilians, similar teeth are also found in insectivores. Likewise, while upwards pointing orbits are generally associated with amphibious animals, Dr. Weems noted that the orientation of its neck would have also given Doswellia an excellent field of vision when on land. Their position would have made it easy to observe flying insects, which Dr. Weems suggested Doswellia could have caught with a sudden, upward strike. The viability of this strategy is questionable given the limited vertical flexibility of its neck, at least in adults. Juvenile Doswellia may not have had a fully formed neutral plate, and crocodilians live as insectivores during their hatchling stage. It was also proposed that Doswellia was a Triassic equivalent of an anteater, using its presumably powerful limbs to dig after burrowing or wood-boring insects. Its long, narrow snout was suited for this foraging strategy, while subsequent discoveries of other Doswellids has proven that they did have powerful limbs and claws suited for digging. However, it is questionable whether an adult Doswellia would have been able to find enough insects to feed itself, as insects that live in large colonies, like termites, aren't known to have evolved until after the Triassic period. Dr. Weems also suggested Doswellia may have hunted fish. While Doswellia was perfectly capable of catching them, as mentioned earlier, it does not have the adaptations of a dedicated piscivore, and its snout may have actually evolved to become shorter than those of its ancestors. The final suggested prey items were crayfish and bivalves, both of which have been found in the same part of the Newark supergroup the Doswellia holotype was found in. The idea is that Doswellia's heavily built limbs evolved to uncover them from the muddy substrate, while its narrow snout could fit into crayfish burrows. If its upper jaw had notches like those of its relative Rugarynchos, its conical teeth could have been used to easily hold on to these hard-shelled animals before cracking their shells open with its petrigoid teeth. This hypothesis seems to be the most likely, as it explains Doswellia's various adaptations. The only problem is that crocodilians, when specialized in consuming hard-shelled prey, have broad snouts. However, since Doswellia's crushing teeth were located on its palate, it may not have been under the same evolutionary constraints, allowing it to retain its narrow snout. archosaurs are the only archosauromorphs known to have survived past the cataclysmic end of the Triassic period 200 million years ago, and the Doswelliids are thought to have been victims of a milder faunal turnover event in North America 15 million years earlier. Still, Doswellia and its relatives lasted longer than most other basal archosaur forms, and acquired a number of unusual traits during that time. Although it has little presence within the popular imagination, Doswellia was an amazing reptile. Thank you for watching, and a thank you to my supporters on Patreon, who chose the subject of this video. By joining my Patreon, you will have access to similar polls to select the topics of many of my future videos. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to hit the like button, and if you would like to see more, consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, be sure to have a great day.